Welcome to the Manumission podcast, the show dedicated to unshackling ourselves from the status quo. Here's your host, H.H. Morris.
Hey guys, Happy New Year. So today we're going to resume with the evolution of government or development of government part 2. It's a best of series from a previous podcast. I hope you enjoyed the first part. So we'll pick up where we left off. And we will go back to doing these live again next weekend, okay? Talk to you then.
In the previous episode, we explored some of the factors that are involved in the human dynamics of power and control. That is, the ability to get others to do what you want. I want to take a moment to make a quick distinction. I pointed to human shortcomings like fear and ignorance as avenues for us to be able to be controlled and to accept authority. Now, this is not the only way to influence humans. The mark of a good leader is to lead with integrity, by example, and by inspiring others to do the right thing. However, the mark of government, as we'll see in this episode, is coercion and force, and that can only be maintained by exploiting people's anxieties and ignorance. As I also explained, power and authority only exist in the minds of those who acknowledge them, but those concepts aren't necessarily evil in and of themselves. A wealthy person might offer me a ton of money to do a job that I find reprehensible, but I can just turn it down. As a business owner, I have the authority in my company in the eyes of my employees, but they can always tell me to take a hike and go work somewhere else. In fact, this has happened on a few occasions. With government, that is seldom an option. Just try not paying your taxes and telling the IRS that you do not condone the use of your money to bomb people in other parts of the world, or to bail out big banks, or to fund abortion or stem cell research. I just chose a few random examples that cut across the left and right spectrum there for effect. So just try doing that and see what happens. No matter how justified you would be in making that decision, they would come after you anyway and put you in a cage if you didn't pay. If you tried to defend yourself, they would likely kill you. So that's why I did not address any of the positive forms of power and influence in the previous conversation. There have certainly been good leaders within the governmental power structure, but what I'm talking about here is the structure itself, and that has never been good. In this episode, I will show how that dynamic of power and authority that has always been part of human nature became institutionalized in order to maintain coercive control over the general population. To do this, I will walk you through the transition of humans from nomadic tribes to civilizations and how the resulting power apparatus has lingered to this day. I will then lay out my argument that through several advancements in technology, we can reach a similar level of transparency and accountability and access to information that was prevalent in the highly egalitarian pre-civilization societies, and that our advanced understanding of human behavior and of the mind can allow us to minimize our susceptibility to fear-mongering and control. We have thousands of years to cover, so let's get started. Paleoanthropologists peg our earliest ancestors to archaic Homo sapiens, to about 200,000 years ago. However, modern humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens, are traced back to Cro-Magnon man about 40,000 years. We'll start with those societies between that time and about 10,000 BC. Be aware that experts divide the Paleolithic and Mesolithic period differently depending on region, but the fact is that although their developments happened at different times, early societies exhibited similar characteristics and evolutions. Paleoanthropologists and archaeologists have been able to make some observations about how these ancient humans lived. And obviously, given that these people lived in prehistoric times, our knowledge of exactly how they lived is limited. However, a lot of what we know about their societies actually comes from studying current hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Yanomamo and Kung tribes in South America and Africa, respectively, given that they still live very closely to how ancient societies lived. So what do we know? Well, as the term hunter-gatherer denotes, they lived lives based around hunting and foraging for food. This kind of subsistence existence had specific consequences on the makeup of their societal structures. Since they spent most of their time chasing herds of game animals and foraging for naturally growing berries, vegetables, and seeds, they were nomadic. This prevented them from accumulating a lot of resources, since it would require them to haul them around constantly. That means that there was little to no personal property as we would recognize it today. Now, they definitely had personal possessions, like weapons and other tools or clothing, that were valuable to them, but not the sources of wealth that we recognize in a civilization economy. Think real estate or just capital in general. So those circumstances, coupled with the fact that all men and women were generally responsible for the same tasks, again, due to the fact that they lived a subsistence lifestyle, resulted in a very egalitarian society. On top of that, since they did not know a lot about the workings of the world around them, much less the universe, there also existed a general equality of knowledge, or I guess you could say lack thereof. Now, that doesn't mean that there was no hierarchy, as we know that they had leaders such as chiefs or priests, but given the circumstances that I just described, the differences between the leaders and the, quote, regular people were not very marked. Everyone had access to pretty much the same information. Everyone pretty much did the same things. And since there were no permanent structures that the tribes were relatively small, up to about 70 people, there was not a lot of privacy, so their society had no choice but to be transparent. Think about it. If you had a tribe elder or a priest, you very likely knew them personally. They lived a life very much like yours, and they didn't necessarily know significantly more than you, save for some mystical knowledge. So we can see that their external circumstances didn't make it easy for the leaders to abuse their power, since they could be held accountable very easily. After all, any decisions that they made would directly influence people that they knew and likely cared about. Accountability and transparency were built into such a culture. That's not to say that leaders didn't at times abuse their power, but my point is that the incentive just wasn't there. So around 10,000 BC, during what experts refer to as the Neolithic Revolution, there were significant developments that gave rise to what we recognize as civilization. Experts differ on the causes and the driving factors of this transition. Some posit it was changes in climate or point to significant extinctions of large game animals, and I'm not equipped to provide a definitive answer to this, but we do know for a fact what took place during this period. People began to settle in one spot. Necessity being the mother of invention, humans began to learn how to control their environment, namely through agriculture, irrigation, and domesticating animals, so that they could address the food anxiety that arose in previous centuries. This had major consequences on society. As mentioned previously, people were for the first time no longer nomads. Being able to grow their own food and for the first time created a surplus of it resulted in a population spike that had not been possible before. Not only was there more food for more people, but women were also able to rear more children at the same time. As a quick aside, keep in mind that although several technological advancements throughout history, especially in agriculture and medicine, resulted in spikes in population, that necessitated just as many additional resources to maintain the new population. So we did not see a meaningful improvement in the quality of life of humans until about the Industrial Revolution. That's what's known as the Malthusian trap, and more on that later. But back to the topic at hand. Population increase is an important part of this analysis, as this was one of the systemic factors that led to the ever-growing alienation between people and their leaders. Once the population of a village, town, and then city grew, access to their leaders and their leadership decreased significantly. As an example, currently in the United States, there is a state representative for every 30,000 people. But how many of us know our congressman personally? I think that anyone would agree that a town of 30,000 is not particularly large, and many cities, kingdoms, and empires in the ancient world were significantly larger than that. Also consider that the new, more robust permanent architecture in these new societies, in effect, was a form of physical alienation. They no longer had the same level of transparency and accountability, figuratively and literally speaking, that nomadic societies had. Moreover, the fact that people were now in one location and building permanent, more secure homes, it was possible to accumulate property and land, which resulted in a new type of anxiety, namely taking care of your stuff. Which leads me to the next point. Another societal change that took place during the Neolithic Revolution was the division of labor, or specialization. Due to surplus farming, not every member of the group had to be involved in food production anymore. So some people were freed to do other things that the new society needed, like architecture, engineering, crafting and other trades, art, and of course, professional politics. This set off another type of alienation, that of different levels of knowledge. What I refer to as the information gap. People no longer knew the same things. They became experts on one thing or another and depended on each other for the other things that they knew little about. This resulted in the marketplace that we would come to know and love as libertarians. However, some were better than others at their crafts and were able to accumulate more wealth than others, and the level of egalitarianism that was prevalent in hunter-gatherer societies eroded. For the first time, people had significantly different levels of possessions, now even property, and different ways of life. Now, I'm not making a qualitative judgment on this. I'm merely outlining the changing circumstances that drove these evolutions in society. Leftists point to this transition to a market economy, the accumulation of wealth, and to inequality as the bane of our existence, but as I will show shortly, it was not those things in and of themselves that created the problem, but the centralization of power, which I will describe shortly. But there were some objectively negative consequences that arose from this transition to civilized society that created other concerns. Anthropologists have found that the quality of nutrition diminished markedly. Although farming had allowed the average person to have access to more calories, the quality of the nutrition was poor overall. This can be seen by the loss of height of agriculture-based society compared to hunter-gatherer society. People on average were 2 inches shorter than their nomadic predecessors, something that we would not regain until modern times. Some of you might be familiar with the paleo or caveman diet movement, which is based on the science gleaned from studying prehistoric man, but I digress. Another negative consequence due to the large amount of people living in one place and in close proximity was disease, which also affected life expectancy. In addition, this new way of life required more work per day, given the fact that one needed to produce enough in their given trade to be able to purchase all of the other needs from other people. As I mentioned before when explaining the Malthusian trap, the increasing population resulting in that much more resources being needed, and people just had to keep up. So now that we have a society that has a large stratified population who is worried about their property, farms, livestock, homes, and an ever-increasing amount of possessions, while spending a large part of their time working, those who sought power and control had plenty of fears and anxieties to exploit. As we discussed in part 1, fear and anxiety makes people very susceptible to the powers that I outline in that episode. So let's explore how the dynamics of leadership changed in this period. I mentioned that even nomadic tribes had some sort of leadership. This was usually in the form of religious figures. Due to the extent of ignorance about the world and how it worked, superstition and religion served to fill in that void of knowledge since very early in our history. Through charisma and mystical knowledge, however misguided or mistaken, religious leaders had a certain amount of power over their tribes. In most cases, these were also town elders who were seen to have wisdom that others didn't possess due to their age and experience, but such a thing can't be quantified. Throughout the prehistoric period, and indeed up until very recently, religion and society have been intertwined in one way or another. But as we saw with pre-civilization culture, there was a large amount of transparency and accountability due to the structure of their society. Religious figures continued to be an important part of society through the transition to civilization. However, given the new circumstances, they were becoming more distant from the masses due to the population growth and the division of labor. This literal and psychological distance allowed them to become mystical figures who were larger than life in the eye of the public at large. They eventually became subsidized by the masses, as can be seen by ancient rituals of sacrifice that included a certain amount of the food sacrificed to be given to priests. This is something that is all over the Bible and in other Near Eastern sources. These are the first vestiges of what we would call taxation. Up until then, it's not clear that this public support was maintained through force, but most certainly through psychological coercion and brainwashing. The priests could threaten individuals or groups who opposed their will with being cursed, or by telling them that God or the gods would punish them, or by convincing people to ostracize those who refuse to fall in line. Also consider that with the physical alienation and newfound concept of privacy, with the building of temples and other religious centers, it allowed for these leaders to plot and scheme behind the scenes, which was much more difficult to do in previous times. The second stage of the development of political power came when some of the aforementioned individuals who had been able to accumulate wealth, at least the ones who also craved power and control, merged with the religious caste. They became patrons of the priests and the temples, and in return, the leaders would give them legitimacy and recognition as leaders of certain areas or groups. This is how entrenched hierarchies came about. All of this came to a head when the inevitable occurred, the clash with other societies and civilizations. While early merchants had already begun trading with peoples of other settlements of different ethnicities and religions, the population at large was completely ignorant about those foreign cultures. This ignorance was easy to exploit by the ruling classes, and even easier for them to plant the seed of paranoia. As the concentration of resources and property grew, so did people's concerns about protecting them. In the cases where some settlements ran low on resources or experienced hard times, they faced a very difficult choice. It was easier for the leaders to dehumanize the barbarians on the other side of the mountain, so to speak, who look and spoke differently and worship other gods in order to call people to arms and conquer them and their resources, than to upend their own lives and homes to figure out how and where to start from scratch. This was also driven by the fact that most other natural resources within reasonable reach were already spoken for by those other groups. That also resulted in the rise of strongmen who rallied men to either mount a defense from invading armies or to attack other groups for their resources and property. Those military leaders who were successful in battle soon became famous for their achievements and were elevated to be part of the ruling classes if they weren't already a part of it, mainly due to the fact that they had armies at their command. This level of external conflict turned the new societies very militaristic and created a warrior culture. Archaeology even shows that warriors were often buried with their weapons and armor, which proves how important warfare became for those people. The archaeological record also shows that as early as the 6th millennium BC in Mesopotamia and later the Mediterranean, like in Egypt and Crete, huge walls were erected around major cities to protect them from invading armies. The entire Near East was thrown into a constant cycle of plunder and conquest by Sumerians, Akkadians, Persians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians, and many other peoples and cultures that in many ways persist to this day, and later extended into the European continent, mainly through the expansion of the Roman Empire. So now we see that early civilization created a structure of a priestly class that controlled knowledge, and even if it was merely mystical, a wealthy caste that controlled most of the resources and property, and a military caste that had the power of force, and each with their own charismatic leaders. As we discussed in the previous episode, those powers at the individual level are very limited, but the consolidation of all of them in one, quote, place, that place being authority, which, as we also discussed, doesn't exist, is what we call government. It didn't take long for this centralized power to be used against their own citizens, especially as people of different cultures were conquered, resulting in a lot of resentment and constant rebellion. This only amplified the need of the use of force, which kept the aforementioned cycle of violence going. Internal and external violence became embedded in those societies. So that's a brief summary of how governments centered around coercion arose. I'm using the term government generically, since every culture's specific government varied in structure of hierarchy, bureaucracy, amount of freedom afforded to its citizens, bellicosity, and other particulars. But they all had those three levels of power that we refer to as the ruling classes, and they all were locked into the same cycle of violence. War, conquest, rebellion, war, conquest, rebellion, around and around. Even as the various disparate societies were consolidated into larger empires like Persia, Egypt, or Greece under Alexander the Great, and in Rome, this became part of the human experience. The Roman Empire brought this cycle into Europe in the attempt to conquer the native tribes of the continent, and they were more than willing to keep it going even after the Western Empire fell and Europe entered the Middle Ages. As we get closer to the modern era, there were a few developments that started to chip away ever so slightly at the three power structures. Let's note that the Middle Ages were spent trying to deal with the consequences of the fall of Rome, at least in the West, and all of the wars between the latent tribes that were trying to pick up the pieces. While most experts agree that it is a misnomer to qualify the years after the fall of Rome in the 5th century AD as the, quote, Dark Ages, this period is marked by a significant decline in classical thought and science that resulted in a huge expansion of power by the relatively new Catholic Church. As a quick tangent, the growth of the Church is a great example of the three sources of control working together. Constantine, a military leader whose mother was Christian, took over as the emperor when he defeated his enemies. Very soon thereafter, he legalized Christianity, which had up to until then been an outlawed religion, and in short order, the church leaders began to have a lot of power. Given that the man in charge was a, quote, Christian, many of the upper class, including senators, proceeded to convert. A few hundred years after the fall of Rome, the Middle Ages saw an upswing in intellectual activity, even within the church, by the scholastics and the development of the first universities. But it wasn't until the invention of movable type in the 15th century AD that it was possible for the masses to have access to information that, up until that point, had not been available to them. That started to erode the monopoly of knowledge that had been enjoyed by the ruling classes since the advent of writing thousands of years prior. This technological advancement also spurred on the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, which gave rise to an intellectual rebirth and broke the monopoly of the Catholic Church in Europe and resulted in the creation of several sects of Christianity. This also led to the Age of Enlightenment in roughly the 18th century that, among other things, spawned a reconsideration of the role of government in human life. The thinkers and intellectuals of that period began to posit that humans had natural rights that could not be violated by anyone, including governments, and that governments should be strictly for the preservation of those rights. You can refer to episode 2 for more information on that. This new approach to government is best exemplified in the American and French revolutions and their ensuing constitutions. For the first time, the laws of a country acknowledged human rights and limited the size and scope of its government. As a constitutional republic, the new government of the United States provided both appointed and democratically elected representatives of the people, broken up in three branches that had checks on each other so as to avoid the concentration of power and allow for as much freedom as possible for the individual. Many other countries in Europe began to follow suit. It's for this reason that the start of the American Revolution in Concord and Lexington are regarded as the shots heard round the world. This was the rise of the modern nation state. With these new governments that were based on the rule of law and the will of the people through voting, a level of economic and technological growth never before seen were unleashed. These freer societies were the intellectual descendants of the thinkers of the Age of Enlightenment, and they made many inroads in science, technology, and medicine due to the very free and open markets. This gave way to the Industrial Revolution as early as the beginning of the 19th century in England, and then shortly following in the United States. With modern machinery like the steam engine, people were finally able to produce and create at an exponential rate that exceeded the needs of the growing population. Thus, humans finally were able to escape the Malthusian trap. Whereas up to that point, everyone led very similar lives to their parents and their grandparents, this new era saw improvements in medicine, transportation, hygiene, food production, and communication with every generation. Thus, the overall quality of life began to improve even for the lowest classes. However, these new systems of government still contained the three sources of power: knowledge, wealth concentration, and force that we identified as requirements for keeping control. Religions no longer were the keepers of knowledge and information due to the turmoil that resulted from the fractious experience of the Protestant Reformation, as well as the elevation of scientific thought. While churches still had a lot of influence on the general population, they no longer had a direct control in the government. Instead, governments co-opted many of the intellectuals and also developed compulsory state education where they became the gatekeepers of what children learned. The biggest improvement came in the distribution of wealth as the capitalist system allowed for more people to improve their lots in life in significant ways. No longer was wealth necessarily married to the government. It was created by producing goods and services that other people needed or wanted. From a military standpoint, these new nation states had been forged in the crucible of war, which kept the cycle of violence turning and actually set off a new imperialism against those other countries that had not had the same developments as the West and were regarded as inferior. So alas, even with those new structures of government and newfound freedoms, the people who sought power and control over others found ways to hijack those systems as well. In a way, it was even more effective and efficient. Let's consider the following. As one would expect, since the ruling classes then and now are made up of power-hungry, self-centered individuals, there has always been a lot of friction and posturing between them, a fact that also made the endeavor of governing a very bloody one. History is rife with examples of kings, queens, emperors, generals, and religious figures being backstabbed, murdered, tortured, etc. by members of their own class. One need only study the history of the Roman emperors and the kings and queens of Europe to find countless examples of this. The rulers of the modern republican and democratic systems of government were quick to realize that such structures provided an opportunity to have power without the risks that had traditionally been associated with it. As I mentioned, rulers historically met bloody ends even from within their establishment, but they also often had to fight in the battles and wars that they started. Many of the leaders in ancient history rose to fame and power in war, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Constantine, Charlemagne, Richard the Lionheart, and many others. The new democratic systems afforded these new politicians a way out of harm's way and to evade instant accountability. Their being voted into office provided their power legitimacy in the eyes of the people and gave the office holder a mandate. No matter what they do, they can always point back at the fact that, quote, the people gave them authority to do it. Even when they do things that most people disagree with, including those who voted for them, they still get to finish out their term, as that is the law. In another show, I will explain in more detail the logical inconsistencies with representative government, but suffice it to say that if someone is voted into office with just over 50% of the vote, and considering that on average only about 40% of eligible voters actually vote, that means that someone can get into an office by only representing as little as a quarter of their constituency. That's hardly a mandate. So, once in power, they also get to decide with a simple vote when and with whom to go to war without them actually having to risk their own lives, which makes war a much easier decision. Without getting too deep into it, the creation of central banks that can print money out of thin air makes war economically feasible, since the expense of war and maintaining a military-industrial complex simply gets passed down to future generations. While these new governments were originally meant to be somewhat decentralized, the reality is that all the decisions lie with the representatives, and they can be bought off in several ways. The populist method of simply offering a politician votes from a lot of people, unions are a great example of this, or the corporatist way in which big businesses or wealthy people lobby or bribe them to pass laws that are beneficial to them and serve as barriers to entry for their potential competitors. Conversely, the politicians can also go out and buy votes from these same groups by offering them favors in return. Again, a central banking system makes it a very easy endeavor, since you can promise something now that doesn't have to be paid until you're either out of office or in the grave. There is plenty more than I can point to about the current models of government to show that they are not much better than their predecessors. It is merely a transition from a traditional, dirty, inhumane cattle farm that you would see in a PETA ad to a free-range farm where the cows might be happier, produce more and higher quality milk or beef, but who are fenced in nonetheless. However, with this transition, the ruling classes planted the seeds of their own destruction. The advancements in technology and the study of psychology that have been unleashed under capitalism, as limited as it is, are reaching a tipping point that will allow for a total breakdown of the power structures necessary for them to maintain control. I focus on the two biggest factors in my opinion. Technology. With the advent of computers, the internet, cell phones, and the like, everyone, regardless of socioeconomic background or location, will have access to the same information. This will inevitably break the stranglehold of public education on the minds of the young, and without a government monopoly of information and knowledge, it is much more difficult for them to brainwash the masses into submission. In addition, the ubiquity of television, cameras, and independent journalism via blogs, social media, or podcasts also allows the people to hold politicians accountable. It is very difficult to hide their wrongdoings. One is hard-pressed to go a day without finding out about a politician's misdeeds these days. From an economic perspective, peer-to-peer technology is making it easier and more cost-effective to do business with people from all over the world and to circumvent governmental restrictions and regulations. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, while it may not end up being Bitcoin itself, will allow people to also circumvent the central banking systems and have cash-like anonymous transactions for very little fees worldwide. So as you can see, these advancements in technology and many others that we can't even imagine right now are creating similar external circumstances that I outlined during my review of the egalitarian pre-civilization societies: transparency, accountability, and decentralization. Also, psychology. This, I think, is the clincher. And that's why I had one entire show talking about the human factor. Even the statists, who are willing to hear arguments about stateless societies with an open mind, usually retort that even if we were able to do away with government in society, it would still devolve into what we have today by corporations or the wealthy taking control, or by another government taking over, yada, yada, yada. This is a specious argument, as that is like saying that one shouldn't try to get rid of something bad because it might come back or happen again. But there is a germ of truth to the point. Unless humans address those aspects of our nature that make us susceptible to governmental power, anarchy is likely to be short-lived. The cycle of violence that was sparked through the development of government ensured that there were enough damaged people in society throughout history to do the ruler's bidding, including using violence on their behalf. As we discussed, it is only due to the belief in this false authority that this has been possible. As we educate the coming generations to think critically, instill values like the non-aggression principle and how to negotiate instead of using coercion, the power-hungry class will have fewer and fewer people who will be willing to be their henchmen. As it is, it's only a very small amount of people who do the bidding of the rulers. I recommend watching Larkin Rose's video on YouTube, The Tiny Dot, for a great example of this. Peaceful parenting is a huge part of this endeavor as well. Stefan Molyneux has done some great work on this topic, and I would also recommend checking him out on YouTube. Technology is also helping in this regard, as can be seen by the explosion of homeschooling and unschooling that has taken place in the United States, thus circumventing the power of the state on our children. So, as the veil of this delusion of authority gets lifted from the eyes of humanity and we become a more peaceful species, government will be rendered obsolete. It will vanish not with a bang, but with a whimper. And the only way that it will stay that way is if the cycle of violence is broken once and for all. So, this is why I think we are living in exciting times. We stand to be the founding fathers and mothers of the most important development of human social evolution. While it might not happen in our lifetimes, we have the opportunity to make leaps and bounds in this endeavor given our access to technology and our knowledge of the human brain and of human behavior. I hope you share my optimism and are heartened by the inroads we have made in making people aware about the possibility of a truly free society.
If
If you want to know how you can help me keep the show going, or if you have a question, comment, or recommendation, you can contact me directly or through social media. Find out how to do all that by visiting Manumission.com.